This is a preview of the subscriber-only Madness episode on Thomas Pynchon's Shadow Ticket. To get full access via Substack or Patreon, head over to madmethodpod.com/subscribe. Enjoy! So, in short, what Wargo is saying is that Pynchon allows for a world that includes psychic phenomena, but in some way he never quite uses it. The world of Pynchon never quite requires it for the actions of the book as a coincidence, or perhaps in Freudian terms. I do find it interesting that late in Shadow Ticket, there's a moment when Porfirio del Vasto succumbs to his, quote, old jewel thief reflexes through some, quote, deep, unacknowledged Freudian means. Now, I don't know if I fully agree with Wargo's criticism here in the case of Pynchon, but I think it might be safe to say that Pynchon, whatever his beliefs about psychic phenomena, largely uses them as a sort of metaphorical device to talk about modern communications in the case of Gravity's Rainbow, and perhaps to sort through the contemporary conundrum of economic realities, overlaid by an ethical framework that they reciprocally undermine. More on that in a little bit. But right now, I'm actually interested in the phenomena itself because the way I see things, I think one of the ways that literary realism is starting to show its age is that it's actually pretty hard to deny that there actually are psychic phenomena of some sort. Many people would say, in fact, that a fairly Pynchonian milieu actually proved what Freud would call occultism way back in the early 1930s.
The world embraced science. Science made industry possible. And industry produced material comforts the mediums and fortune tellers could never provide. In the bustle of the new scientific age, the Western world dismissed things like ESP as unscientific. Not until the 1930s did serious researchers, such as J.B. and Louisa Rhine, perform well-controlled experiments with ESP. Their work showed that ESP does exist. But most people still found it difficult to accept ESP as a reality.
Joseph Banks Rhine, J.B. Rhine, with all due credit to his wife Louise, who was an intellectual in her own right and would eventually come to be thought of as the first lady of parapsychology, established the parapsychology lab at Duke University in the year 1930 with the support of the older psychologist William McDougall, a noted opponent of the in vogue behaviorism of B.F. Skinner and a Lamarckian who, in resonance with the president of Duke, who hoped to restore the spiritual dimension to American psychology. McDougall gave J.B. Rhine an on-ramp to psychical studies, helping him transition from his botany work at West Virginia University. Rhine would teach regular psychology courses at Duke for many years, but the real focus of his work was to see if he could find some scientifically measurable core to explain or refute, as by most accounts he was a real scientist through and through, some of the phenomena he'd observed in seances. J.B. Rhine not only provided some excellent data that makes a strong argument for some form of extrasensory perception, a term he coined and for which he literally wrote the book in 1934, but he represents something like the missing link, though maybe not so missing, in the arc of modern psychical thought between spiritualism and, say, the remote viewing of psychic spies and the latest surge in the overall kind of meta-phenomena represented by the telepathy tapes. If you really want to understand how this field developed, you probably have to start with the Fox sisters of Rochester, New York, whose hoax kicked off the spiritualist movement. You have to get your head around just what was going on in the so-called burnt-over district of upstate New York in the 19th century. Check out episode 1 of Method Madness and perhaps read Harold Bloom's The American Religion for some more info. And then you have to follow that thread through the ideas of Oliver Lodge, an important physicist who held a bunch of critical patents in early radio communication and served as president of the Society for Psychical Research from 1901 to 1903. And then you'd have to look at the phenomena of channelers. Take, for instance, a woman named Pearl Curran and her spectral familiar Patience Worth. Some research was done in this period with varying degrees of success and formality, but to get from capital S spiritualism to remote viewing and beyond, you've got to go through Rhine. Okay, what did this guy do exactly? Well, one thing he did was to start treating it all like a science, and that meant starting to break it down. He defined 4 to 5 fields of psychical research or parapsychology. The first, where he did the most groundbreaking research, was that of the parapsychical. Stuff like telepathy and clairvoyance, dowsing, pre-visionary dreams, and spirit communication. But there was also what he called the parapsychophysical, telekinesis, levitation, apports, psychic lights, and psychometrics, that is, obtaining information from touching objects, which is something Thessaly Wayward claims is possible in Shadow Ticket. This was all distinct from parapsychophysiological, which includes materializations, stigma, extrusions from the body. And there was also the parapsychopathological, to include things like demonic possession and psychic healing. Lastly was the parapsycho-artistic, sometimes fitting under the first category, which includes channeled writing and creative work that is impossible from natural training. In his landmark book, Extrasensory Perception, J.B. Rhine provides an overview of his first 3 years of formalized research into telepathy at Duke. During this time, he conducted well over 90,000 trials. And in what I think to be a very Pynchonian moment, these investigations really kicked off with Rhine's examination of the claims surrounding a purportedly telepathic horse named Lady, whose abilities range from predicting boxing matches and earthquakes to aiding in the case of a missing 4-year-old boy. Initially, Rhine was impressed by Lady's feats, but a follow-up investigation indicated to him that the horse's answers were not always so accurate as people thought, and that Mrs. Fonda, Lady's owner, was clearly signaling to the horse. Nonetheless, this effort helped Rhine to refine his approach to testing human subjects. For instance, Rhine tested groups of children to see if any of them could guess a number from 0 to 9 at a rate exceeding chance. Then, with his associate Dr. K.E. Zenner, he of the famous Zenner cards you've seen in Ghostbusters, he performed an even more formalized kind of guessing game using sealed envelopes with numerals on them. They carried out 1,600 trials, finding nothing of evidence except for a single subject, Mr. A.J. Linsmeyer, who seemed to be able to guess above chance. In fact, in early trials with Linsmeyer, he was able to guess multiple times over what would be expected statistically. Rhine, Zenner, and now a growing team of parapsychical investigators started using the Zenner cards in late 1930. Among 800 trials from 1930 to 1931, with a variety of subjects, Rhine documented a hit rate of 207, greater than 1 in 4 on a trial that ought to be 1 in 5. It might not seem like much, but consider how crude these evaluations were, performed on random people in a context that wasn't so much focused on what may or may not be the most suitable conditions for a telepath. For instance, if the mechanism of how this all works is that the person being questioned is seeing the cards in the future, that is, predicting their future moment in which the card is revealed to them, might not there be some confusion about whether they're seeing the very next card flipped or the one after that? Further trials of card guessing, some with subjects in a trance or purposely fatigued, were carried out with similar findings, and if one takes Rhine's experiment seriously, some people at least, really do seem to be able to guess cards at a rate significantly over chance. Rhine and his students, as well as other enthusiasts, would run thousands of trials in the early 1930s, and virtually all of them indicated guessing over chance. One guy named Hubert Pierce, a ministerial student whose mother was supposedly a psychic, would eventually, after initial scores as math would suggest, score nearly twice as many correct guesses as one would expect based on chance alone. Fascinatingly, when they tried the trials after dosing Pierce with sodium amytal, not enough to knock him out, but enough to make him sleepy, his scores dropped back down almost to chance. Conversely, the effect of caffeine seemed to increase whatever telepathic powers were in play. If strangers were around, Pierce's score would start out around chance, but go up as he got more comfortable. Eventually, Rhine would also vary testing, all documented of course, between trials in which the subject was shown the card after choosing and those in which they weren't. Those in which the subject wasn't told whether they got them right or wrong until the end, or in which they were told with each card. They tried distance and screens. The importance of all these perturbations in the testing methodology is, of course, that they should have no effect whatsoever on what is, ostensibly, a random process. I won't bore you with many more technicals here, but just note that Rhine tested hundreds of people and ran tens of thousands of trials. Here is what I think is a critical statement from Rhine's book Extrasensory Perception. Quote, "It does not seem possible that any reasonable and honest doubt can exist in the mind of the reader who accepts this data as reliably presented, and if it is clear to him, that there is amply demonstrated in these tests an extrasensory mode of perception of the type popularly known as clairvoyance or telepathy." End quote. And so it was that people who read Rhine's book came to believe that, on some level, ESP or telepathy or clairvoyance had been proven. But among the expert class, the case was not so clear. In 1936, the psychologist W.S. Cox at Princeton University conducted more than 25,000 trials in playing card ESP, very much along the lines of Rhine's experiments, and found no evidence of any kind of psychic phenomenon. Flaws in methodology were identified by another Princeton psychologist by the name of Harold Gullickson, who claimed that Rhine was overly vague about his method and implemented improper mathematical evaluation in distilling his results. Other issues regarding the means by which Rhine carried out his experiments were identified as well, up to and including the possibility that percipients were reading the results off the corneas of the experimenter sitting across the table from them. Rhine's later experiments with psychokinesis, in which subjects purportedly willed dice to land on a certain number, were criticized because dice can be, quote, drilled, shaved, falsely numbered, and manipulated. Now, most of these criticisms point to some level of dishonesty or incompetence. And yet, upon Rhine's death in 1980, a very interesting obituary was published by the American Journal of Psychology. Quote, "The book Extrasensory Perception created both a popular and a professional stir. The popular reaction was largely uncritical and approving. The professional one was the opposite. Both Rhine's testing procedures and his statistics were sharply criticized by a number of psychologists. These criticisms led to a number of changes in detail in the collection and analysis of experimental data, but not to any major ones. Among the most frequent criticisms were that A, subjects could see the outlines of the symbols on the backs of the ESP cards due to overly heavy printing. B, scoring and recording errors produced many of the extra chance results. And C, the statistical significance tests were improperly applied. The first criticism caused Rhine and his coworkers some embarrassment because it was both correct and irrelevant. The first runs of commercially produced ESP cards were defective in the way the critics pointed out. They were not the ones used in Rhine's early experiments, however, which instead used lightly stamped designs on cardboard cards. Prospective users of the commercial cards were warned in an early issue of the Journal of Psychology to use them only with complete screening between the subjects and the cards. The second criticism, insofar as it was testable, was answered on the basis of those experiments in which the target cards and the subject responses were recorded independently, either as an extra control measure or because of the distance between the subject and the cards. On reanalysis, scoring errors were not found to have produced any spuriously significant results. Their frequency was low and included both false negatives, hits scored as misses, and false positives, misses scored as hits, although more of the latter. As the original data were, and still are, available for further reanalysis on demand, the replies seemed cogent. The third criticism was the most widespread and the most interesting because it was so nearly baseless. Rhine's statistics were mostly conventional and were ratified at an early stage by prominent statisticians. Nevertheless, they were objected to the point where some objectors, such as the physicist P.W. Bridgman, eventually argued that there must be something wrong with our understanding of probability theory if it could be used to support conclusions such as Rhine's. End quote. Now, just to reiterate that last bit, one of the criticisms of Rhine's work, in which he came to believe he'd proven telepathy, was that we must not understand numbers as well as we thought. Now, in addition to what was laid out there in that obituary, a later meta-analysis of the replication efforts and other reviews of Rhine's work was performed by a later Rhine colleague, the parapsychologist Charles Honorton, a kind of parapsychological prodigy who died young, due in part to issues related to his dwarfism. This analysis done by Charles Honorton told a very different story. Quote, 61% of the independent replication errors of the Duke work were statistically significant. This is 60 times the proportion of significant studies we would expect if the significant results were due to chance or error. And then in 2020, parapsychologist Rick Berger broke down the figures further for the Parapsychological Association. Quote, in the 5 years following Rhine's first publication of his results, 33 independent replication experiments were conducted at different laboratories. 20 of these, or 61%, were statistically significant, where 5% would be expected by chance alone. End quote.
Well, we have evidence that there's something more than that. This thing that we call psi, which can influence people without the use of the senses.
Scientists believe that psi is a means of communication that we don't yet understand. When we take in information through psi means, it is known as extrasensory perception, ESP. When we send out information without the use of our muscles, that's known as psychokinesis, or PK. But no matter whether the psi is ESP or PK, these experiences are so far from what we consider normal that it's hard to accept that these things could actually take place.
what we know of ESP does not fit in with the current scientific framework. Now, we have very good evidence that ESP and other psi phenomena do occur. So the obvious conclusion is that the current scientific framework is fundamentally incomplete. Now, this isn't particularly surprising. Science is always changing. Science is a dynamic process, and it really only represents the current best guess as to the nature of the universe.